And hey, what's up? This is Wilsford with Abysmal Hems, and I have brought back my friend Shoshana, who was talking about the psychology of demons. But she is also has a rich history in working in the news media and had over a couple decades with CNN as well as working in National Public Radio. So uh, I'm glad to have you back, Shoshana. And so wanted to kind of talk about, like it's been pretty noticed recently how, from my perspective, it seems like that, the lines between social media and the news have shifted so much now that people are just so divided. I was seeing a statistic that was saying like with something like CNN that while 78% of one side of the fence gets their news from that only like 17% of the other party gets their news from that. And then I was thinking about when I was planning to do this about how, like in the Walter Cronkite days, things seemed very like cut and dry. And, how that shift has kind of affected mental health. I mean, one thing is like now we carry news around us on our phones, you know, 24 hours a day when people used to just tune in at, 5 or 6 o'clock and digest it. And I know that, the media bias has shifted. It started like back in the 80s when Ronald Reagan changed some of the FCC regulations. And then it was, in the 60s, you had the momentum of the anti-war movement and the hippies seeing kind of like objectivity as like as being complicity with part of being part of the system, um, and then that news went from being nonprofit as something that they didn't see that they were going to make money on to something that they need to start making money on, and then like shows like 60 Minutes got really big and started turning more into entertainment. Um, so in your experience, when did you feel like things were shifting?
Okay, so in fairness and transparency, though, I just want to say I didn't work directly for National Public Radio. I worked for an affiliate station and freelanced a lot for National Public Radio and other sort of national radio newscasts, just for clarity. So, the story of the frog in the pot of water, and it doesn't notice that it's boiling because the water is heating up very, very slowly. I think that I was the frog in the pot of water for a long time, um, at, at least in terms of working for an international cable news network. Because when I got there, it was independently owned. Still, it was bought by a corporation, and the corporation made changes slowly. So I didn't really notice that I was boiling until I was already boiling. And there's a lot of factors that went into that because, yes, people tend to be really concerned about bias, but bias depends on your own positioning, right? If you are very, very far left, everything looks very, very far right. And so it becomes hard to gauge that positioning. And there are other things behind it. Like, I think there's this idea that it's ideology that's driving these shifts, but it's really, and that's maybe true for the people on the front lines in the newsroom, but it's not what the corporation cares about by and large. The corporation cares about making profit, and whatever strategy is going to get eyes on the screen so that they can charge higher advertising rates, they are cynically going to implement that strategy. So there are other factors besides overt bias that are part of the decline and fall, as far as I'm concerned, of American journalism. They're not as sexy, and people don't necessarily get as outraged about it. Um, but corporate ownership of news agencies, to where I don't remember how many corporations own how many outlets, but it's pretty outrageous, to where legitimate competition between newspapers, which are dying anyway, but also between local stations, radio stations, TV stations, all of that competition and sort of regional presence has been knocked out by this pervasive corporate ownership. And the corporations, by and large, are not, again, driven by ideology. So, yeah, there's bias, but what it is and where it comes from and how it manifests itself is kind of complicated. And again, depends on your positioning, because for a lot of people it's like, oh, they're not reporting this story the way I want them to report this story, therefore it's bias. And I guess there are objective evidence of that, but the visioning is difficult.
Right. And I know with like, you talk about when the corporations get involved. I know with like CNN, I think it went from Time Warner, who is also owned by Advanced Publications, and that traces all the way back to Samuel Irving, who was like a 1920s newspaper tycoon, So, and I think that that's the thing. A lot of the newspaper like New York Times, that for a while that was like the pinnacle of journalism. Um, and I guess everything has either shifted. Like if you're a print publication, then you had to make the adjustment to become an online presence. So,
Mhm.
and I guess with becoming more of an online presence, which can be said, I guess, for even the major networks now, a lot of people just are looking at it online rather than on cable TV. So that factors in. And with that, I guess the headlines of how you capture the clicks, factors in. Did you notice that kind of
Hugely.
transition or no?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and just one more point about the corporate ownership. It's like, yes, there are buyouts and mergers. So, the global elite companies are kind of switching these things in and out like it's playing cards or
Right.
something. I mean, it gets very hard to even keep up with who owns who, so that it sort of feels like just this giant demon that's owning everything. And there were times in my own newsroom that I kind of felt like I was on a train shoveling coal into the engine, because it's this 24/7 cycle, as you pointed out, and it's like hungry all the time. And so you're shoveling information sort of into the maw of this giant beast. And of course, it becomes less careful and less concerned with what journalism should be concerned with. But yes, the technology makes a huge difference, and I actually saw a lot of technological change in the decades that I was in um, news, broadcast news primarily. I've not worked print nearly as much, but even moving from analog technology to digital technology made a difference. And I'm just talking about production technology, not even distribution technology. But when you get to distribution technology, it makes a huge difference. And you throw in social media, and then news organizations aren't even, getting their own video. They're not even necessarily on the scene. They're pulling video off Twitter, X now, but Twitter at the time, and they're pulling video off Facebook. And I remember the first time that happened was kind of somewhere during the Arab Spring revolutions, as I recall, when the news agency started pulling things off Twitter with this disclaimer of, we cannot verify this video 100%, but we have vetted it, and I remember sitting in the newsroom going, then why are you putting it on the air? But that's not even bias, of course. That's just, well, it's much cheaper, And so you get reporters out in the field with an iPhone instead of with a satellite truck and a crew, and things absolutely change. I was horrified when they started across the industry because I'm not here to bash my particular news agency. I'm here to talk about an overview, right? So when there were cutbacks in news bureaus, for example, around the world, and cutbacks in real photographers, video journalists who were journalists and knew how to shoot in a specific way and how to edit in a journalistic way. And they started cutting them back because you could hire, a just out of school graduate and stick an iPhone in their hands. This makes a huge difference in the quality, in the verifiability, just in the way the whole thing works. So,
Right. And I
yeah.
guess, what's getting more concerning too is now with AI, that's probably going to
Mm.
even muddy the waters further because then, you said with the like Twitter videos of we can't verify it. It's like with AI, you can't. Well, what are we even verifying as real this point at this point, you know?
Right. And that's already even been a problem. Like, I have a story for you kind of from back in the day. And again, I'll fudge the names to protect the guilty in this case. But you had a reporter who was a very respected reporter doing a report that looked like it was from the field, but she was standing in front of what was called a chroma key. And I mean, now we've got much worse than that in terms of AI and deep fakes, but that was already a problem. Um, there was a thing called a look live, and this is a reporter recording a report as though they're doing it live, but they're not. And you think that's a small deception? The anchor's thanking the tape. Thank you, Will, for that report, as though you're actually standing there, but it's on tape. To me, all of those small things erode both credibility and confidence. And now that you have even more technology where you can do even more of that sort of cosmetic, shall we say, adjustments, it gets harder and harder to discern what is real and what is happening. And there's other things that added to that too, but I'll let you jump in. But certainly not knowing what's real has a terrible psychological effect on people who are looking for accurate information.
Right. And also, I guess kind of stepping back into the, well, we're out to make money now part of it is what makes money is having people invested, emotionally invested in what they're watching because they're less likely to, you know, go click over to something else. Well, now I'm going to watch football or whatever. Um, and so with that, it seems like that some of the writing style is now catered, particularly even when you compare it to like the verbiage that was used in the Walter Cronkite days, where there was less emotional wording, and now that that has been like amped up, obviously intentionally, not like in a conspiratorial sense intentionally, but like, we got to keep people invested in this. Here's how to get them hooked.
Eyeballs on screens. And that is absolutely overt. That the push for more emotional language, the push for very emotional descriptions, that is an overt request by management in newsrooms. Make the script emotional, pull on the heartstrings. There's no trying to disguise that. That's absolutely overt. And, you know, I didn't like it. And I don't like it. Um, so that was a sea change in the profession overall of moving from let's inform people so that they can make informed decisions. And sure, if this is terrible, let's not away from showing them that it's terrible, although, like, I think people know war, for example, is terrible. How much do you have to tug on their heartstrings, But okay, if we want to show the truth of something that is awful and dehumanizing, don't shy away from showing the truth. But not everything needs to be an overt appeal to emotionality, because again, that's not informing people. It's just kind of jacking them up into an emotionally incontinent state. And think we see the result of that, in our civil dialogue, which you know, the media pour gasoline on that fire instead of trying to calm it down as it did, in the days of the big three of Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings, who was my personal favorite. They were calming. You could tune into that with a crisis going on and get facts and sort of feel like you could wrap your head around things. And it's completely the opposite now, obviously. And yes, I think that's very detrimental, and I didn't enjoy writing that way. That's not
Right.
how I was trained to
And
write.
the two emotions that they're obviously plugging into is fear and anger. And fear and anger both kind of tap on the fight or flight response. So
Definitely.
you're getting cortisol released. You're getting those, shifts in physiological responses to emotion. Um,
Definitely.
which in
Definitely.
like crisis mode, if you're presenting crisis mode news to further use verbiage that, extrapolates that, I think that that's kind of a problem. And
I think
that would
it's
be like a problem ethically too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a problem. I mean, because what you're doing from a psychological perspective is you're throwing off people's autonomic nervous system. And yeah, putting that into an imbalance, triggering that cortisol constantly, it keeps eyes on the screen, and ethics. That's a whole can of worms, in and of itself, because you got to remember journalism is not a profession in the sense of law or medicine. There's no, overweening journalistic body that has an ethics code. Like individual places have ethics codes, but they're not enforceable except at that particular outlet. You can fire somebody for something egregious, but if I'm not going to lose my journalism license if I do something egregious, because there's obviously no body that accredits, you know, journalism. So it's always been a matter of personal credibility and ethics that made journalism work. There was trust at some point in, okay, this person is not behaving in an unethical manner, and this person is telling me the truth. That trust has just completely broken down. And losing trust is also terrible psychologically.
Right, because then it puts you in an even more anxious spot because you're kind of like that horse trying to cross the river. Keep having to just tap in one space to make sure that it's stable, that you can go further. And yeah, so I'm definitely hearing that. So when you're working in that environment, how taxing was that for you emotionally and energetically just to be enmeshed in that?
It was horrible at the end. And I'm somebody who's very much a natural storyteller, whether it's through writing, whether it's through academia, whether it's through journalism, whether it's through music. That's very much a sacred calling and a vocation for me. So, kind of watching that eroded, or sitting by as it was eroded, occasionally putting up a fight, because I did. I mean, I got in a lot of battles. I was not going to win a Miss Congeniality award in that newsroom. I felt that I would go down fighting, but it just became impossible, and I felt like my hands were dirty. And I'm a person with a fairly developed code of honor. and feeling like I was part of something I considered dishonorable was very psychologically damaging to me, which is why I just finally had to go. And there are other reasons for that, but disliking seeing propaganda terms introduced into journalism was distressing to me. You know, you're talking about a news show, not as a news show, but it's a platform. And you're going to restrict access to that platform, or you're not going to normalize a voice on that platform. It becomes a propaganda undertaking at that point, not a journalism undertaking. And that language was extremely disturbing to me, that it's because of an overall erosion between opinion and news, which there used to be firewalls between the editorial sort of branch of the organization and the promotional branch of the organization and the news branch of the organization. And those firewalls have been completely torn down, and a lot of viewers do not have the training to recognize the difference. So an opinion program seems like it's a news program, and to them it looks like bias because there's no firewall.
Right. And so it kind of propaganda definitely makes me think of how propaganda used to be separate from news. Like propaganda came in pamphlets. It came in, that's like half the origin of comic books, in World War One and World War Two. Superman, Wonder Woman, Captain America. Captain America was created for propaganda. So, fortunately got a storyline after that when Stan Lee stepped in. But, um, up until that point, it was two separate things, and now that they've been merged, um, it kind of like I was watching, it wasn't, I think it was MSNBC, and I was noticing how all of the commercials were all advertising some kind of medication. Like it wasn't just one or two, it was all of them. And I was thinking,
That's
well,
about demographics.
right, right, right. And if you want to keep somebody in need of medication, well, a lot of fear and anger will certainly help with that.
Right, right, right. Absolutely.
So, in current day, when you sit down and digest news now, what stories and subject matter do you feel are being handled the most atrociously?
Well, it's sad to say I don't trust any mainstream sorts of news organizations anymore. So I read really broadly and really critically. Like I'm reading the far left, I'm reading the far right, I'm looking at news aggregate sites that will help you see who's covering what, and what slants are being taken by what publications. And then you're sort of looking for, okay, well, what's universal, sort of across the spectrum? Maybe I can count on that. But fortunately, we do live in an age where you can go to primary sources yourself. You can see the speech for yourself in its entirety often and make your own decision. You can watch the videos, you can look up the bill, if you have the stomach for reading some 500-page monstrosity of a badly written, obfuscating, you know, piece of political propaganda. But if I care enough about an issue, I become a very active investigator of that issue because I don't trust any kind of mainstream organization 100%.
Right. And
And I don't think you can.
I've noticed that often it's not necessarily what they report, but what they don't report or the priority it gets. Like it was almost hilarious that when all of those UFO papers dropped and they were doing the congressional hearings on that, where the Air Force was saying, listen, this is a national security emergency because we don't know how to handle this, that there'd be maybe 10 stories down, if that, a blurb about it, It's like, so they basically have come out and said that
Definitely.
all this is real, and people are like not even paying attention, you know. Just like I noticed
Yeah,
with this
absolutely.
the summit that they did in it was like in China recently with China, Russia, North Korea, and India, which should be major news. And it was if you were like on Al Jazeera or watching Indian news. There's nothing about it on news on any end of the spectrum at that point.
Yeah, I really think that we're in an era where just as you kind of have to be your own healthcare advocate, you
Right.
have to be your own investigative reporter. You really have to take control of what information you consume, and you have to do it, with kind of a lot of active attention and a lot of comparisons. And again, fortunately, we have access to things like transcripts or video of congressional hearings, so you can go look yourself because the sound bites are and quotes are often taken totally out of context or positioned in a way that makes a person seem like they were saying one thing when in fact they were saying completely another thing. You just have to kind of do it yourself, but I understand that most people don't want to because, I mean, that's time consuming and it takes a lot of energy, but then you have people who are kind of hardened into ideological positions that are not based on accurate information.
Right,
And
right.
consume what you don't agree with. That's really key because we have this confirmation bias and this echo chamber effect where people are only consuming, and I kind of hate that word, but that's what it is when it's commodified. They're only consuming information they agree with to begin with. Like, go see what other people are saying and be curious about it. Because incuriosity is the worst thing to me about journalism right now and about people's response to journalism. There's no real curiosity. Well, why does this person think this way? Why is this thing happening? And you have to kind of cultivate that curiosity on your own because the journalists are not cultivating it for you.
And two, I think that there's a rise in people just seeing like headlines of stories, probably not even reading the article themselves when they repost it, but they see the headline, well, that's going to get me some likes. People are going to start arguing with me about this because I just posted this headline. And, I think in kind of in the Twitter age, like all your thoughts in 64 characters, everybody's just working off the cliff notes. Nobody's reading the whole book to get the context, is
True.
at least how
And
it looks.
headlines aren't really headlines. Headlines are what we used to call teases.
Right.
They're designed to kind of draw you in, whereas a headline classically gave you the essence of the story. So there was a time, that you could kind of peruse newspaper or online headlines and at least get a gist. Oh, the president spoke here. Oh, this happened there. Oh, this war is continuing. But we don't have headlines anymore. We just have teases that are meant to entice you to click. So you
And
can't rely
had
on
had
that.
it already switched over into that when you were in the field.
Gradually was doing so.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Because then it was, don't give away the story. Okay. But people don't watch television with their full attention. And there are studies about that. People are eating, they're in all kinds of contexts. They're at a hotel bar, like whatever. They're not fixed on it. And I think they're maybe hearing like 30%, if even. So
Hmm.
if you don't give them an actual headline or like a clear lead into the story, they may well not get the gist of the story. And that's kind of really irresponsible to me also.
So where do you see this heading as far as the overall mental health implications that this type of thing could have as it continues? Because I don't see it as something that's gonna get better. Like all of a sudden we've gained a conscience and let's, clean up our act. But
No,
where do you see this
no.
going as far as like the psychological impact it's going to have on people.
Yeah, I mean, unless people kind of take charge of guarding their own mental health and well-being and being very selective in what they consume, I think we'll see more anxiety and depression that is triggered by the ambiguity and the lack of trust. Some of the imagery is just awful. Like you see kinds of violence that you wouldn't have back when I started in journalism. You weren't going to see that. But now you're going to see it, not necessarily on cable news per se, which, by the way, I think is going to die as a genre or as a format, but other things will replace it. So whatever. You see that now. I mean, we all saw, and I don't want to get political, but we all saw Charlie Kirk shot in the neck. We all saw that because it was everywhere. Whereas back in the day, that wouldn't have been shown. And
Right, right.
so, yeah, it would never have been shown. You did not show an actual death on the air that was pretty written in stone, back in the Jurassic era when I was trained as a
But
journalist.
it's funny because the one time that I remember, and even though I wasn't alive when it happened, but the image is so impactful, even if it's just on Misfits 45s that I have, was the JFK shooting
Hmm.
where that happened. And it seemed like there was a similar response where I can hear the buzz of people wanting a grassy knoll and a lot of convoluted stuff with that story, just because maybe being exposed to that graphic imagery is too much for them to accept that of what happens. We have to dress it up in a further story.
Back then, that would have been a really shocking image, though, and it's not now
Right.
because we're so desensitized to that kind of imagery. That was as far away as it is, as grainy as it is. That was a really shocking image back in its context. And I know we're running out of time. I want to make one more point if it's okay.
Sure.
I I don't believe there's ever been a quote unquote golden age of American journalism. There's always been what was called yellow journalism. There's been tabloids. There's always been skullduggery, if you'll excuse the archaic word. I don't think we've ever had like this golden age. And I was recently doing some research and read some New York Times articles from the early 20th century that were appalling. They were they were just so prejudicial and appalling. So there's a reason that people don't like the media and have never held the media in high esteem. I think the technology, the 24/7 news hole, and the corporate ownership and the political manipulation are just more intense than they ever were before. But I don't think we can point back and go, okay, Edward R. Murrow made everything perfect because he didn't.
Right,
Where
right.
there's journalism, there's power. If you control information, there's power, and people have always been driven by power. And so that there's always been that corruption, I think.
Right. And when you think of tabloids, always think of like Bat Boy and how, with the Inquirer like or Sun News, Bat Boy was like obviously if you're buying Bat Boy, not saying he's not real, but if you're buying Bat Boy, been done in such a P.T. Barnum way, and now you look at the same tabloids and it's like the secret gay life of Katy Perry. Well, I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
less extreme than Bat Boy. Maybe this is something, you know. And I got a whole
That boy
nother.
was a lot more
Yeah, I
interesting,
mean, Bat
honestly.
Boy needs to come back. He's really the only
Totally.
hope, I think. We're gonna have to send like a R2D2 message to him. Bat Boy, your only hope. Bat Boy Kenobi, save us.
Yeah, I missed the news of the world on the grocery store checkout line. That
Yeah,
was actually
Bigfoot got a lot more
awesome.
press back then. than he does now.
Indeed. Indeed.
So, well, cool. We'll have to get you back on and maybe get into some of the, more spiritual implications of the energy generated by the news. But appreciate
Absolutely.
your time and look forward to seeing you again.